Cast your burden on the Lord, and He will sustain you. Psalm 55-22. Dear friends, welcome back to God's Word in the Clouds. I'm grateful you're here tonight. Whatever kind of day you had, whatever weight you carried quietly in your heart, this is a moment for you to breathe. Some days the heaviness inside us doesn't show on the outside. We go through routines, we handle responsibilities, but something deeper feels tired. And when that kind of tiredness stays too long, it begins to shape the way we think, the way we move, and even the way we hope. Tonight, I want to share a story about a man who reached that point without even realizing it. A quiet moment on an ordinary night became the turning point he didn't know he needed. If your heart has been running low, if you've been holding more than you let others see, I think this story may speak to you in a way simple advice never could. So take a slow breath, settle your thoughts, and let's step into it together. Michael had driven that highway 100 times before. Same route, same distance, same dark horizon stretching out in front of him. But that night felt different. It wasn't the road or the weather. It was something in his chest, something tight, something heavy, something he'd been ignoring for weeks. He kept his hands steady on the wheel, but the longer he drove, the more he realized he didn't have much left in him. He wasn't exhausted from lack of sleep. It was a different kind of tired. The kind that settles behind your ribs and stays there no matter how much coffee you drink or how early you go to bed. He tried to shake it off, tried to focus on the lines on the pavement, but even that felt harder than usual. When the weight in his chest didn't ease, he eased off the gas, pulling the truck onto the shoulder. The world outside was quiet, too quiet for a man who'd been running on noise and motion to keep himself together. He turned off the engine and let the silence swallow the last bit of hum in the cabin. For a moment he just sat there, fingers still curled around the wheel, waiting for his breathing to settle. It didn't. He leaned back in the seat, staring through the windshield at nothing but darkness. The road stretched ahead, but he couldn't bring himself to keep going. Not yet. Not like this. His mind had carried too many thoughts at once. Bills waiting at home. Deadlines he couldn't miss. A family that counted on him even when he had nothing left to give. He never talked about any of it. He didn't want to sound like he was complaining. He didn't want to look weak. So he carried it all in the one place no one could see. But in that quiet truck cab, with no one around and no reason to pretend, the truth finally caught up to him. His hands were trembling. His chest felt tight. And for the first time in a long time, he felt completely alone with the weight he'd been dragging from one day to the next. He wasn't the type to cry. He wasn't the type to break down. He usually pushed through anything life threw at him. But this wasn't a problem to solve. This was a man reaching the end of what he could hold without something giving way. He let out a slow breath that felt more like a release than a sigh. The kind of breath you exhale when you've run too far on empty. His eyes stayed fixed on the darkness outside the windshield, but his thoughts finally stopped running. They settled into something simple. Something honest. Something he'd never said out loud, even though it lived in him every single day. God, I'm tired. He didn't yell it. He didn't break. He just let the truth fall out in the quiet, because there was nothing left to hide behind anymore. For a few seconds after he spoke those words, nothing happened. The cabin stayed dim, the night stayed still, and the road behind him kept humming with the distant sound of passing cars. Nothing changed on the outside, but something inside him, loosened like the tightest knot in his chest, had been pulled just enough to breathe again. Michael rested his head against the seat and closed his eyes. It wasn't a prayer he planned. He didn't come looking for a moment with God. He just ran out of places to hide the truth. Sometimes honesty arrives that way, quiet, sudden, without ceremony. And once it shows up, you can't push it back down the same way. A soft warmth settled in the air around him. Not a presence he could describe, not a voice or a sign, just a gentleness that didn't exist in the truck a minute earlier. He didn't understand it fully, yet he didn't question it either. When you've carried too much for too long, even the smallest sense of peace feels like someone finally taking a hand off your shoulder. He opened his eyes and stared ahead again. The road was still dark, but it didn't feel as threatening. The quiet didn't suffocate the way it had moments before. It felt more like space he hadn't given himself in a long time. His thoughts began to settle, one by one. Not in neat order, not with perfect clarity, but enough for him to see what had been happening. He hadn't been weak. He'd simply been human. He hadn't failed. He'd been carrying life the only way he knew how. And while everyone saw the strong version of him, no one knew that strength had come with a cost he'd been paying silently. He placed a hand over his chest and felt the slow, steady rhythm underneath. Somehow it felt different, still tired, still heavy, but no longer drowning him. It reminded him of something he hadn't felt in months, his own presence. When life keeps you busy, you forget what it feels like to just sit and exist without expectation. In that stillness, he whispered again, not out of desperation, but out of recognition. "Help me through this." The words weren't dramatic. They weren't poetic. They were simple, the kind of request a worn-out man makes when pretending is no longer an option. He didn't expect an answer. He didn't expect a miracle. He didn't expect anything at all. Yet saying it felt like unlocking a door he had kept barred for too long. The heaviness didn't vanish, but it changed shape. It no longer felt like it was crushing him from the inside. It felt like something he could manage for the next hour, and maybe the next one after that. Sometimes that's all a person needs, not a full solution, just enough strength to take the next step. Michael started the engine again. The hum returned, familiar and steady, and the headlights pushed a narrow path into the darkness. That small beam was enough. He didn't need to see the whole road. He just needed a few feet of light to keep going. As the truck rolled back onto the highway, Michael didn't feel fixed. He didn't feel renewed or suddenly strong. But the road didn't look as unforgiving as it had before he stopped. The white lines passing under his headlights didn't blur together the way they did earlier. Each one felt like a small marker pulling him forward at a pace he could finally handle. The night air slipped through the slightly open window, cool and steady against his face. It grounded him, gave him something real to focus on, instead of the dull ache that had been living in his chest all week. Even his breathing felt different, still heavy, but no longer fighting itself. It was the kind of shift that doesn't show on the outside but changes everything on the inside. A few miles passed before he realized he'd been gripping the wheel too tightly. His hands relaxed, almost on their own, as if his body finally believed it didn't have to brace for another wave of pressure. He wasn't in the clear, but he wasn't drowning. Sometimes that's the only progress a person gets in one night. He thought about heading back to the company yard, calling it early, maybe taking a day off tomorrow. But he knew himself too well. He'd push through the shift just like he always did. Still, tonight felt different, not because his situation changed, but because he allowed himself a moment he'd been refusing for too long. He replayed the moment he whispered those two words, "I'm tired," and wondered why they felt more powerful than anything he'd said in months. It wasn't a dramatic confession. It wasn't an emotional breakdown. It was just the truth spoken without fear. And truth, once given room to breathe, has a way of clearing the fog. Another truck passed him, headlights sweeping across his cabin. For the first time that night, he didn't feel invisible inside his own life. He didn't feel like a man carrying everything alone. The small ease he felt earlier was still with him, subtle, but steady enough to remind him he wasn't walking through this weight by himself. He glanced at the passenger seat, empty yet strangely comforting now. He'd spent so many nights filling that space with stress, thoughts, and expectations he never voiced. Tonight, it felt more like a place where he'd finally set something down, even if only for a moment. A green exit sign appeared ahead, glowing against the dark sky. It led to a quiet town he'd passed 100 times but rarely noticed. Something inside nudged him, not a dramatic push, just a gentle sense that he didn't need to keep driving aimlessly. He took the exit, letting the truck slow as it curved off the main road. The town was asleep, streetlights casting soft circles of yellow onto empty sidewalks. Michael parked near a closed diner, turned off the engine again, and sat in the silence. But this silence wasn't like the one earlier. It didn't suffocate. It felt like space to sit, think, breathe, without the pressure of being okay. He wasn't healed. He wasn't fixed. But, for the first time in months, he wasn't pretending. Michael stayed in that quiet parking lot longer than he planned. The diner was closed. The street was empty. and the only light came from the sign above the door, buzzing faintly in the calm night air. He didn't step out of the truck. He didn't need the cold or the silence outside. He had enough of both where he sat, but he wasn't trying to run from anything anymore. He was finally letting himself feel what he had ignored for too long. He rested his hands on his lap and let his shoulders relax. It was strange how unfamiliar that position felt. Most days, his body stayed tight without him realizing it. Tonight, the tension slowly left, like a rope being loosened knot by knot. He didn't know if this quiet was God, or exhaustion, or just him finally stopping long enough to hear himself think. Maybe it was a bit of all three. He looked at the diner again. He had eaten there a few times over the years, usually rushing in and out between deliveries. Tonight, it looked different, still closed, still dim. But for some reason, it felt like a reminder that life didn't always have to be fast. Some places stay still. Some moments pause. Some nights don't demand anything from you. His phone buzzed once in the cup holder. A message from his daughter. Just a simple, "Good night, Dad." Nothing heavy, nothing complicated. But it hit deeper than she would ever know. He stared at the screen for a long moment. He thought about all the nights she texted while he was on the road, and how he always replied with the same quick answer, as if he had nothing more to say. Tonight, he typed slower. "Good night, sweetheart. Love you." He sent it and exhaled in a way he hadn't done in months. Sometimes softness feels harder than strength when you've carried life like armor for too long. But his heart needed that softness. It needed something real to hold on to. He leaned back again and let the quiet wrap around him. He didn't try to force clarity. He didn't chase answers. He didn't plan the next day. The noise inside him had finally lowered enough for him to understand what he needed. Not escape, not solutions. Just honesty with himself and honesty with God. A small shift happened in his mind. Not dramatic, not emotional. Just a simple realization. He didn't have to do the next part of life the same way he did the last part. He didn't have to pretend everything was fine. He didn't have to push until he broke. He could pause. He could breathe. He could ask for help before reaching the edge. Michael placed a hand over his chest again, feeling the steady rhythm that had once felt like a burden to carry alone. It didn't feel that way now. It felt like something being held, like he wasn't the only one responsible for keeping it going. When he finally started the truck again, he wasn't stronger. He wasn't wiser. He was simply more honest with himself than he had been in a long time. And sometimes, honesty is the first real step toward healing. What happened to Michael that night isn't rare. Most people don't collapse in dramatic ways. They don't shout or break down or fall apart in front of others. They hold on until the weight becomes too steady to ignore, and then something simple forces them to pause a quiet road. A heavy breath, a single moment when they can't hide from their own heart anymore. If you've had nights like that, you know the feeling. You sit alone with your thoughts, unsure when everything started to feel heavier. You look back and realize you've been carrying more than you should sometimes for years, without stopping. Long enough to notice the toll it's taken on you. It doesn't mean you're weak. It means you've been trying to hold life together without giving yourself space to breathe. Michael didn't meet God in a dramatic moment. There was no bright light in the truck, no sudden answers, no instant change. What he got was something small but real. The sense that he wasn't carrying everything alone anymore. The pressure didn't disappear, but it loosened. And sometimes that's the only miracle a tired heart needs, a little room inside. Just enough to breathe again. Maybe you've been doing the same thing he did. Maybe you've pushed through your days without letting yourself stop long enough to feel what's happening inside. Maybe you've convinced yourself you can manage everything, as long as nobody sees you struggle. But that silence starts to stack up until even the quiet feels loud. You don't have to wait until you reach a breaking point. You don't need to earn a moment of rest. And you don't need to pass every test life throws at you without flinching. It's okay to admit you're tired. It's okay to slow down. It's okay to ask God for help with nothing more than a whisper like Michael did. When your heart has carried too much for too long, you're not looking for miracles, you're looking for relief. Maybe relief doesn't come in the form of a solution. Maybe it comes as a soft shift inside you, the way it did for him. A shift that says, you don't have to handle this the same way anymore. Michael didn't walk away from that night with his life fixed. He walked away with something better: honesty. He finally spoke the truth he'd been trying to outrun, and that truth became the starting point for every step he took afterward. Your story might not look like his, but the weight you hold might feel the same. If tonight feels heavy, or if you've been pretending you're fine when you're not, maybe this is your pause. Maybe this is the moment where you breathe long enough to admit that carrying everything alone isn't working anymore. God meets you in moments like that, not with noise, not with pressure, but with the quiet assurance that He's closer than you realized and more gentle than you expected. When Michael pulled back onto the highway and started heading home, nothing in his life changed instantly. His bills didn't vanish, his responsibilities didn't shrink, and the long days ahead were still waiting for him. But something inside him wasn't the same. He had finally stopped long enough to tell the truth to himself and to God. And that truth opened a small space inside him that pressure had closed off for months. Most of the time, that's how healing begins. Not with big events, not with spiritual fireworks, not with sudden clarity. It often begins with a single honest moment in the dark, when you finally admit what you've been running from. God doesn't need speeches or perfect prayers. He responds to sincerity more than anything else. Maybe tonight, you're in a place similar to Michael's truck cab. Quiet, heavy, unsure how to move forward. And maybe you didn't come here looking for a message or for answers. You just wanted a moment where you didn't have to act like everything is fine. That alone is enough. You don't need to pretend here. You don't need to be strong every second of your life. If this story reached you, it's probably because you've been carrying more weight than people around you realize. The world rarely sees how hard you work to stay steady. But God sees the parts no one else notices. The small hesitations in your breath. The tired thoughts you push past. The emotions you refuse to name because naming them feels risky. None of it is hidden from Him. You don't have to wait for a dramatic moment to ask for help. You don't have to reach the end of your strength. You can stop now right here, in this moment, and let yourself breathe. Whatever is heavy in your chest, whatever has been tightening your thoughts, whatever has been stealing your peace, God understands it long before you speak a word. Let's pray together. God, tonight we bring you the weight that has been sitting on our hearts. We bring the pressure we rarely talk about, the worries we keep quiet, and the tiredness we hide. You know the places where we feel stretched thin, and the moments when we pretend we're okay, even though we're not. Give us the calm we've been missing. Give us steady ground under our feet. Give us enough strength for the next step, and enough peace to rest without guilt. Walk with us through the parts of life that feel too heavy to carry alone. Thank you for being close, especially on nights like this. Amen. Thank you for spending these minutes here tonight. If the story of Michael reminded you of something in your own life, hold on to that feeling. You don't need to rush past it. Let it guide you toward a gentler way of living, one where you don't ignore your limits and you don't pretend your heart is invincible. Rest well tonight, dear friends. And remember, you don't walk alone.